Good afternoon. Today is February 21st, 2023, and we'll be going over the patch notes today in this video. It is a surprise patch, not something I was expecting. Didn't see any information that would indicate this was coming today, but we got it. And so we've got some cards moving down from Series 5 to Series 4, Silver Surfer, Null, Darkhawk, and Sentry. Null probably the most impactful on the meta. Can expect to see Null in Destruction decks as well as Galactus decks more often. Pretty sad about that, to be honest. Not necessarily about it being in the Destruction decks, but about it being in the the Galactus decks more often. Pretty sad about that. Some cards move from Series 4 to Series 3. That'd be Agent Coulson, Maria Hill, and Helicarrier. I don't anticipate any of those having an impact on the meta. We have some balance changes. Darkhawk moves from a 4-1 to a 4-0. I do own that card, so I'm not biased about it. In my opinion, this change was entirely unnecessary. The Darkhawk deck is out of the meta. In my case, that's actually a good change for me because my favorite deck to play Darkhawk in is Mighty Thor. I don't think his old Zabu deck is very good at all. He's decent in Mighty Thor, and this just makes him better in my Mighty Thor deck because now Jane Foster will draw him. So this is a good change for the only deck that I play the Darkhawk in. This is actually a buff. The developer comment says Darkhawk is an especially powerful card. As we prepared this balance change before the Silver Surfer and Zabu nerfs went live, we didn't want to hit him too hard. However, we definitely felt that knocking off at least one power from him is warranted, and we will continue to monitor his performance. I disagree with that entirely, both in philosophy and in execution. The philosophy of preparing a balance change to Darkhawk before the Silver Surfer and Zabu nerfs went live doesn't make any sense at all. You would want to see where the deck shapes up after Silver Surfer and Zabu to determine if it's a problem still or not. Because once Zabu is nerfed, Darkhawk might not be a problem at all, so making that change before Zabu nerfs doesn't make any sense. And I don't agree that decreasing his power by 1 was needed either, because I never see this card anymore. His deck isn't at the top of the meta. It isn't even a tier 2 deck in my opinion. It's just not good, and so this doesn't make sense to me, but at a personal level I'm in favor of it because now he's better in Mighty Thor Jane Foster. So that is the balance change for Darkhawk, now a 4-0 instead of a 4-1. Next up, we have a balance change for Thanos. This change really only makes sense to me in context with the Sandman change, so we'll go over them together. Thanos has changed from a 6-8 to a 6-11, so that's a buff for him of 3 power. That's a large buff. Developer comment, we think Thanos is one of the coolest cards, and we're a bit sad that he himself isn't played often. Most Thanos decks focus primarily on making good use of the stones, but we want to make sure the Mad Titan himself has enough power to play. I don't disagree that Thanos isn't played very often. However, the Thanos deck is at the top, near the top of the meta right now. I would rank it as the second best deck, second only to Shuri Zero. And a buff to Thanos of 3 power, which is quite large, gives the Thanos deck more options than it previously had. So that's a big buff to the deck. However, there was also a change to Sandman today. A pretty big change. Sandman has been changed to a 5-5. Previously a 4-1, he's now a 5-5, so he was buffed by 4 power, increased his cost by 1. Players can only play 1 card per turn is his ability. The dev comment, many of the strongest decks right now have strategies centered around playing multiple cards on turn 6. Sandman should be a good answer to these decks, but he didn't quite have the sand to stand up to them with his previous stat line. We're giving him a bit more power to make him a more competitive card, but also subsequently bumping up his cost. I disagree with this nerf in philosophy, not necessarily in execution. The premise that many of the strongest decks have strategies centered around playing multiple cards on turn 6, I don't disagree with. However, I don't see that as a negative either, because combo decks make the game more exciting. Moving the meta away from combo decks will make the meta more stale, because opponents' decks will be easier to read, and your own deck will be easier to read. And the easier it is to read the decks, the less likely players are to snap or to call snaps. I've already seen that in the meta after the Silver Surfer and Zabu nerfs. I see players far less interested in going to Showdown, far less interested in snapping or in calling snaps. And this Sandman buff is going to make that problem even worse. In addition, buffing Sandman to counter combo decks hits the only good free-to-play deck right now, which is Deathwave. It hits it hard. It hits Thanos as well, but the developers buffed Thanos, and I said I would talk about Thanos in relation to Sandman. I believe that's the reason for the Thanos buff, is this Sandman buff. The developers wanted to hit combo decks, but they didn't want to hit Thanos. And so they gave the Thanos player a buff to the card, or to the play, which would be just their really only option for a single card play on turn 6, which is to play Thanos. So they made that play more viable to compensate the Thanos player for Sandman getting buffed. But they did nothing to compensate the Deathwave player, which means this is just a straight nerf to Deathwave. And I'm seeing a consistent pattern with the developer buffs and nerfs right now, which is that they seem to specifically not want any free-to-play deck to reach the level of a pay-to-win deck. And so anytime decks do provide counterplay to the pay-to-win decks, they're nerfing them. They did that with Arrow and Leader, who provided counterplay to more costly decks that would cost more to build. They did that to Silver Surfer and Zabu, who were themselves pay-to-win cards, but they were Dolphin cards. Dolphin meaning a player who is willing to spend a little money, but not a lot. And a whale would be a player who's willing to spend a lot. So Silver Surfer and Zabu were Dolphin-friendly cards in that they cost $10 each, and were likely within the budget of almost any serious card game player, because card games tend to be very expensive. So the Silver Surfer and Zabu meta, in addition to the Leader and Arrow meta, provided counterplay to more expensive decks, and were arguably even more powerful than expensive decks, so they got nerfed as well. Now the top 3 decks, Shuri, Thanos, and Deathwave. Shuri and Thanos are pay-to-win decks, with Shuri costing $110 and Thanos costing $220. Deathwave being the only free-to-play deck that rose close to their level, and now the developers have provided counterplay to counter Deathwave, but not to counter Thanos or Shuri. Shuri only wants to play 1 card per turn anyway. And now this Sandman deck will counter and eliminate or reduce in the meta some of the combo decks that could have potentially given Shuri trouble. This Sandman nerf is a nerf to Sarah Miracle. It's a nerf to, not to Patriot. It's a nerf to Mr. Negative, a big one, and it offsets the buff that Darkhawk provided. We'll see how much people play Sandman. The best use of it is going to be in the Electro Ramp deck, where you could play it on turn 4 and then get 2 turns of the Sandman benefit. The card does nothing against Shuri. In fact, it's probably good for the Shuri 0 deck. It hits Deathwave the hardest, I think. And thus, the meta moves a little bit more toward pay to win, though it does buff Electro Ramp, and Electro Ramp is a free-to-play deck. Now, how much does it buff Electro Ramp? I think it really just evens out the difference between Electro Ramp and Deathwave. Before there was a clear difference, Deathwave was better. Now is Deathwave still better? I'm not sure. I'm not convinced that it will be. Electro Ramp might get a little better, and Deathwave gets a little worse, but neither of them get closer to Shuri Zero, and neither of them really get closer to Thanos either. So, you know. I think overall the pay-to-win decks get a little bit better, and the free-to-play decks get a little bit worse. Not a fan at all. If you're trying to make a game in which free-to-play players can compete, if you're not, that's fine. Most card games are like that. Honesty and transparency about it would be nice, but they're not going to come out and say, yeah, we're making a pay-to-win game. But it is, and it's moving increasingly in that direction with each card, with each balance patch, it seems. Next up, we have a change to Spider-Woman. She's been buffed by 1 power from 5/7 to 5/8. She afflicts all enemy cards here with -1 power. Previously, I would have said she was a good card when played in a lane where the opponent has played 4 cards. That was almost never the case before turn 6, and even on turn 6 you would need for the opponent to have initiative. Now, this is a good card if the opponent has played 3 cards in a lane, and that happens all the time, so I would say this is a very solid 5-drop now. Plug-and-play 5-drop that could see play in a wide variety of decks. Probably in just a straight-up good cards deck. It's a solid card now. It was close before, now it's a very solid card, and could see play in a wide variety of decks. We also have a change to Namor. Namor has been buffed from a 4/5 to a 4/6, so he now provides 4/11 power if this is your only card at a location. He was already decent in like Pool 1, Pool 2 type of decks. That will definitely increase. It'll increase the number of players running him in those decks. Is he good in any normal deck? Nah, the power wasn't the issue. It's if this is your only card here. There are situations where you will play him as like a turn 6 surprise. He could even see play in some Zabu decks as like one of the 2 4-drops that you play on turn 6. If you had a blank lane available and your opponent hadn't played anything there, an 11 power surprise could be quite good. So there are situations where he'll be good. Is he going to see play consistently in any top deck? No, I don't think so. He could potentially see play in like a 2nd or 3rd tier deck, I think. Doesn't fit into any of the top decks. And he doesn't elevate any of the decks that are outside the top tier to the top tier. I'm not really sure the reason for this change. I guess this is just a card they wanted to see players play more. There's no developer comment except that the cards below are rather weak at the moment, so we're giving them a small buff to help them perform better. That applies to Spider-Woman, Namor, and Dagger, which is the 3rd card that's been buffed. It's been buffed from a 2/1 to a 2/2. A movement card, which almost never saw play in the movement deck. I don't expect that to change because the power of this card wasn't the issue. It's unwieldy to use. When this moves to a location, +2 power for each card your opponent has there, so it really only is buffable, seriously buffable in the late game. So, yeah, Dagger and Namor are kind of meh buffs. To me, we might see them more, but the Spider-Woman buff I feel is impactful, as that's now a pretty good card. So anyway, that's the patch notes for February 21st, 2023. There's a variety of quality of life changes to some of the texts of different cards and locations to make it more clear what they do. and then some bug fixes. But the big impact of this patch is going to be in the Sandman buff, and to a lesser extent the Spider-Woman buff, and we'll see where the meta shapes up after this. But in my opinion, the game got a little bit more paid to win, as it has with every balanced patch since I've been following the game. So, thank you for watching.